Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back in to talk about healer trinkets in Antorus, the winners, the losers, what you should be going for when the raid drops, and what you should be telling your raid leaders to prioritize, alright? Keep in mind, for these tooltips, they might look a little bit different when you experience them in-game. There's a little bit of discrepancy from the WoW links I have here, and from in-game. A lot of my analysis and a lot of my research for this is just based off of the different logs that I've seen and my own experience playing and practicing with these different trinkets, and looking at the good situations, what classes might prioritize them a little bit more, and where I think you should be prioritizing them. So let's get into it. S tier, top tier trinkets. Aman'Thel's Vision takes the cake, takes the crown easily. This is a trinket in a field of its own because it is just ridiculously powerful. It's full-on Arcano Crystal, which grants you lots and lots of tertiary stats, on top of being a Pantheon Trinket, which of course grants you a very strong intellect buff when it procs with others. So the Pantheon Trinket, there's Pantheon Trinkets that are spawned for all the different specs, and what this basically does is, if I believe it's four trinkets are proccing at the same time, then you get this secondary effect when you get empowered by the Pantheon, where you get your increased intellect. So it can be any kind of trinket. You could have 4 Aman'Thel's Visions, I believe it's 4 or 5 Aman'Thel's Visions, or it could be 1 healer and 3 or 4 DPS, all proc at the same time, something like that. If they all line up, you're getting this buff, which you should, again, because a lot of people are going to be going for it, you should be able to get pretty consistently. So this is in a tier of its own. If you get this, you are one lucky devil. Moving on to A tier. The next 3 trinkets here are all going to be pretty similarly rated. Getting them overall, depending on the spec that you're going to be in, it's going to be a good thing to go for. But some specs, again, might prioritize one over another. Starting off with Carafe of Searing Light, perfect example. This is going to be an awesome disc trinket. Intellect with an on-use effect. Sear an enemy with Holy Light, inflicting holy damage over 18 seconds. Every time damage is dealt, you get a little bit of mana back on a 1-minute cooldown. This is really high uptime. Almost 20 seconds on a 1-minute cooldown is really, really high uptime, and it can work very well depending on the fights that are going out. I think this would be an even better disc trinket if it was all front-loaded, if it was all damage in one burst, but that might make it a little bit too crazy overpowered if it's for the Disciplined Priest, so they probably had that in mind when they were designing this. Either way, it will line up fairly well with Evangelism. You might have to hold on to it for maybe a little bit, then you can proc it maybe a little bit earlier than the Evangelism, depending on how many atonements that you have out, depending on the damage that goes out. But it can be a very good option, and it can also give you a very strong amount of mana back before any kind of encounters end. I've been seeing people who have been using it fairly weakly, and it's still, doing just as good as we saw out of like Amalgam 7 Spine back in the day. And if you're using it correctly, it should be even stronger than that in many, many cases. So I think this is going to be a very powerful trinket for Disciplined Priests. For other healers, I can see this as being a fairly decent, fairly solid overall mana trinket if they really, really need it. So what you would get out of this is that you just, because Darkmoon Deck Promises, for example, is not going to be scaling any higher, if you're in progression content where you just really need some extra mana, this could be a good option, could be a decent option in order to just kind of switch to, make sure you're getting a little bit of extra mana back, that you'll be having a little bit more resources to get through a dangerous encounter or something like that. But for Discipline, definitely be going for this. It's going to be extremely good. Garathi Feedback Conduit. This is in Trinket with a on-equip effect. Your healing effects have a chance to increase your haste for 8 seconds, stacking up to 5 times. More likely to occur when you heal allies who are at low HP. I can see this being very powerful for Druid in particular, and many Druids I saw on the PTR were already running with this trinket. For other healers, it's basically just a good stat stick. You're always going to be prioritizing people who are at low health anyway, so that's already kind of covered for you already. So it's going to be something that's going to be a decent stat stick. If you really like haste, this is something that you as a class or you as a spec would be wanting to go for. But I think Druid in particular would want to have this much more than other specs. Finishing out the A tier, A&R's Compassion. Again, these are all pretty similarly rated. I might have strengths for one spec over another, right? A&R's Compassion, lots of intellect, and you have an equip effect. Your healing effects have a chance to grow an Emerald Blossom. Healing a random injured ally every 2 seconds, lasts for 12 seconds. Because it's also a Pantheon Trinket, whenever you're empowered by the Pantheon, your next 4 direct healing spells grant the target a shield, preventing damage for 30 seconds. For Discipline, it's Plea, and I believe for Holy Priest, it's Flash Heal. Those are the direct healing spells that you'll be able to have access to. It's unique to every single spec. They have a one spell that will be applying these shields for you, so you have the option to choose who you're going to be applying it to, and you have the option to delay casting those abilities if you don't have to, in order to get proper shielding on somebody else. The shields are not gigantic, but you do want to make sure that they're going to be well-timed, well-placed, and things like that, in order to be putting it on targets that can have a good effect. It could even just be that, you know, a tank is taking tons of damage and you want to make sure that they really have some extra shielding, although that's more of an extreme scenario. But the overall healing for this is actually quite strong, especially when you're making sure you're getting good Pantheon procs. Everyone's got Pantheon Trinkets. So you might actually see this before a lot of people in your raid get the Pantheon Trinkets. You might see this as being fairly weak. But as more people are getting it and the consistency of the Pantheon proc grows, because again, you need to have other people proccing their Pantheon Trinkets in order to proc yours, your extra bonus effect. So with that in mind, as long as you're making sure that, you know, other people are getting it, it'll definitely grow in value over time as more people are going for it. For Holy Priest, I see us using this quite a bit, if we are so lucky to go for it. But like I said, the other trinkets in this A tier will also be good options if you're not able to go for this. And moving on to the B tier, this tier is going to consist of okay trinkets. That'll be fairly good, but just not as good as the other higher tiers. Something that's going to be not completely horrible, but a decent option. Starting off with Highfather's Machination. Mastery with an equip effect. Your healing effects have a chance to apply a charge of Highfather's Timekeeping for a minute with a max of 5 charges. If an ally falls below 50% health, those charges are all instantly consumed to heal them. Now, the problem with this is that this is a trinket that gets worse and worse over time. Unlike ANRs, which, you know, at first is kind of weak when not many people have the Pantheon Trinket, this one is very good in progression until you start getting better or you overheal fights. And in that position, then this trinket just gets worse and worse. When you're having less people dropping to 50% HP, when you're having these charges which are sitting on people for very long periods of time, and you're maybe not even getting value out of them at all if you're in an extreme scenario, this is a trinket that has good potential, but is not quite reliable, and while it can save a lot of lives, it's not something that you're able to really draw upon the strength of it. It kind of just does its own thing, and you're really applying a lot of the weight and the strength of the trinket towards an effect that relies on people getting lower. So it's an okay trinket. It'll do decent healing, things like that, but there's many better options to go for that'll be a lot more consistent, a lot more active for you to be able to maintain and put out higher HPS. The Taratus Keystone. Intellect with an unused effect and a 1-minute 30 cooldown. Open a portal on allies' location that releases brilliant light, restoring health split amongst injured allies within 20 yards. Much like, of course, Highfathers, you know, this is a decent trinket. It can do some solid healing. We've seen many trinkets actually in the past, kind of like Keystone, which have had healing effects attached to them like this, which will be split healing, which will be sharing it, all kinds of things like that. And they all sort of do okay HPS, especially if you're considering that it already has intellect on it. But compared to the A-tier trinkets, they're just much better options to kind of go for. So if you have poor trinkets and you find this one, go for it. But I think there will be many better options to go for later on down the line as you're looking at the S-tier and A-tier. Moving on to C-tier. These are the bad trinkets / very niche trinkets. Starting off with Ishkar's Fell Shield Emitter. This is versatility on it, and it can place a very big shield, about 1 million to 2 million, and it also scales with your versatility. Absorbs that much damage for 9 seconds. There's a very short shield timing, but when the shield is consumed or it expires, it explodes, dealing half of the absorbed damage as fire, split amongst all enemies within 8 yards. So it's actually a really short range. This I see as much more of a niche trinket. If you're not putting it on a target like a tank, for example, that's facing up against allies, or sorry, it's facing up against enemies right in front of it, right on it, then it could just explode on like a hunter and just deal no damage to anything because he's not standing near any enemies, right? So you'd be losing out on that kind of damage effect. I see this as being quite good in Mythic Plus. It's more of like a niche scenario, so if there's going to be a burst happening on one class that has poor defensives, if you see who it's going to be targeting, you can apply a really big shield onto them instantly, and you'd be able to hopefully prevent a lot of the damage, hopefully prevent them from dying, and usually versatility trinkets can be pretty strong for high damage encounters like, you know, you might be facing already, or like you might be using this Fell Shield on to begin with. So I think this is more niche. I think this could be good for high Mythic Plus pushing, but overall I don't see it as being a very competitive raid trinket. And finally, rounding out the list, we have the Vitality Resonator. Another versatility trinket, on use, 1 minute cooldown. Redirect the life force of an enemy, increasing your intellect by up to about 10k for 15 seconds. This grants more intellect when used against targets at high health. I also think this is more of a niche trinket in many ways. If you're able to be fighting a boss which has, for example, consistently high HP as you're going through it, kind of like Odin or kind of like Helia, for example. You know, those can be pretty solid. But basically, the trinket starts off as being extremely powerful and then gets worse and worse by the time the fight goes on. So from a raid perspective, this sounds really bad. And generally, the end of the fight are a lot of times where you're requiring the most HPS. We saw that with Avatar, we saw that with Kil'jaeden, where consistent damage really required you to have lots and lots of healing available. So if anything, I'd want to have the best effect possible at the end of the fight when my resources are more limited and the damage just keeps on ramping up into like a softened rage, right? So for this, I think it's going to be very poor overall, because again, you know, as a healer, you really want to have a lot of your stronger effects either consistently across the board, or one that you can control very easily. That'll be, I'm getting the same thing every time. Or if anything, you'd want to have it near the end of encounters, right? So this trinket doesn't really match up very well for healers. It's an okay effect, but it kind of reminds me of like Horn of Valor, which in many ways as a healer is pretty meh overall. And in fact, this one's actually a little bit worse off. That wraps up my healer Antorus trinket review. Let me know what you guys think, if there's some trinkets that you think I might have overrated, underrated, things like that. And of course, always keep in mind, Warforged, Titanforged, Socket, Tertiaries, all that stuff's going to be a thing. So some trinkets might grossly overpower another just because they're 20, 30 something item levels better. So always kind of keep that in mind. I'll have a more extensive list of gear in general that I'm going to be targeting for my healer specs and my priest specs, and I'm going to be going over those in a separate video coming up very soon. So thanks so much for you guys for watching. Be sure to check out the live stream. I will be streaming all of my mythic progression if you want to be checking that out. The link is going to be in the description below. Until then, thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you all next time.